céim a hasisih.
Ha mi Gléidheadh, tapaléh, cimime a hasisih.
Ha mi gan tappaí.
Gléidheadh.
Agus chain tenim a horse.
Smisha Heather Sparling.
Agus Colaisde how.
Well, sound in Toronto hami vo hús, agus an drasda hami a fúdach an in Howie Centre, agus hasin ddíreach fascéir Sydney.
Agus catchinjach the hocal.
Chaim a hocal an in Toronto cúteach. Chad a glúis mi an seo gús dávile sa coig.
Agus fel is like a chase squanid a hacketh. It tub the bad or the
Well, so Maher, Shin, William, Seamus, Sparling, agus Chaniel, so Chanie Albanach hound Maher, Ijar, so Hanig and Trillach Ekison, she Trillach Gedamel chi agus chayet gu 18 agus so she enam von Sparling a vakin agus gacherich shin gu Sparling out in 18 agus hanik na Sparlings gu Canada as je shin tiv mo vahed shin Louise Ailey Louise nich ericher agus shin and Trulach Albanach a hakamsa so hanik ietsen vo alaba vo cromar agus sin acha guma fasgeir bremar agus ha sin fasgeir obergéin. Tuv an alba. Ach va Gaelic ans an acha sin a chanyelis akin ma va Gaelic ek na sincher an akamsa. Chanyel sin gubulach kinchach ma va Gaelic an ach va berla ach a gudjerev. Skriv Kova shin mo henner. Hannig essen vo alaba agus skriv essen joer from Cromar to Canada. Aunen nu kiet jieg fiket sa jig. Nu da hannig egu Canada agus skriv e muyen en turis a reiniet. So va berle agus vai literate out in Berla Kucha Chanyelis akam va Gaelic eka. So shin and chill get da hiv.
Dus you can roll. Very back. And this just sounds fair when ethnomusicologist Gaelic. What is your name?
My name is Heather Sparling.
And where are you from?
I'm from Toronto originally, and now I live in Howie Centre near Sydney.
Right. So you were brought up in Toronto.
I was.
And then you moved?
I moved here in 2005.
And I asked you what Swannog you had. What is your genealogy and where your people came from?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't have a very good, thorough slonjog on both sides. My father is William James Sparling, and the Sparlings are originally a German name. It's von Sparling. But they anglicized to Sparling in Ireland, and so there's still Sparlings there, just outside of Limerick, actually. And then once they anglicized there, they came over to the New World, and so we have the Sparlings here. On my mother's side, my mother is a Farquharson, so she's Ellen Louise Farquharson. And the Farquharsons came from Scotland, from Cromar, which is near Braemar, near Aberdeen. And so we don't know whether they had Gaelic in the family. That is a Gaelic area traditionally, but I've never heard of Gaelic in the family, so I'm not sure. And when I think it was my great-great-grandfather came over to settle in Canada, he wrote a book called From Cromar to Canada. I think it was published in 1830. 1930, no, it must have been 1830. Sorry, 18. I said 1930 in Gaelic, but I think it's 1830. And he writes about his experiences of coming to Canada and of settling in Canada. I'd have to double check those dates again. I'm getting them mixed up. But anyway, he did write this book and wrote about those experiences. So he's obviously literate as well in English, so I don't know about the Gaelic.
Okay. So in this tell me who do Elwas in the Gaelic name.
Well, Kiar she skiel kaden imig ilchoch hoshik mi an Indonesian an alaba. So vamia furach an alaba an Indonesian sin bliana nu de vamia Genev and came Olhai, a he came Olhai around me. So Vashin out in 1994 to 1995. Agus around me cursa oiche, economic ounce Gaelic, agus va gulakamer. So nu de hield me go Canada, hoshich me came graduate out in Toronto, agus ha commerciach Gaelic out in Shin. So around me cursig in Gaelic in Shin. Ach, ik nu now, chai a hula teacher Gaelic ye leis an opera vachka, agus charo teacher in erakol. So, gainig na golanich, en boering gonse, agus gish elig, na cursig in a charo more in Gaelic akam, ik kan eacher, a charo dinja ele owners in a hekishk. So, hoshik me Gaelic a hekishk, agus mar ha fis akosha. Nu a hashiv a Czechishk, hashiv gmayolach a husber. So yonsik mi more in Marshen. Agus kuchach ekenu naam va mi a toshcha get rausach ge yenev and Shaw and Cape Breton. So vashin ons the 90s. Agus hanik mi a machasharsen fieldwork yenev. Agus raimi kursich in Colaisde Guthan, raimi kursa eka Colaisde na Gaelic. Raimi buchen oproch. A hula shorsa de root Marshen. Agus, kuchach ek en Gléidheadh va karamaka mir Senegal erash gu alaba an davilis hun gu ga, velschen kersh no, davilis agagu 3 ek sol morastig, agus va blina akamin shen kuchach. So, va mo kuch Gaelic fata na biad ek an am shen as jay blina and shen. So shin kimid, yeah, so va teacher the netter Gaelic Jackum, agus cursich in netter Gaelic and Shaw, Alapa, Toronto, so va meska gegaan. Well, tapeleef.
How were you introduced to Gaelic?
Yeah, so I was saying it's a bit of a complicated story. So my first encounter was in Edinburgh. I lived in Edinburgh for a year in 1994 to 1995. I took a year out of university and I went and worked there and I took a night class in Gaelic and just loved it. And so when I started my graduate studies in Toronto, I sought out the Gaelic community there, started taking classes there. There's a bit of a community. But all the teachers kind of left and retired all at once. And so there were no teachers left to teach Gaelic. And so several students asked, there were 3 of us, asked if we would teach the classes, even though we hardly had any Gaelic ourselves. And we did. And it was in the act of teaching others that we learned so much about Gaelic. We learned a lot. And then I started doing field work for my graduate studies here. So that was in the late 90s. And I started doing Gaelic classes with Jeff MacDonald. And I was at the Gaelic College. And I did workshops with Katrina Parsons. And all different kinds of teachers, different kinds of environments for learning Gaelic. And then one of the greatest opportunities I had was I went back to back to Scotland. I went to Solmarostig from 2002 to 3 and took a year there. And it was all through the medium of Gaelic. And so my Gaelic really improved at that point too.
Yes, great. Wel Gaelic ek coinnacket.
Well, ek in Toshoch. So, ga do vriend me ach Gaelic ri, so ha mach gakam, agus shin kieren. Agus chado chlecht mi ach Gaelic leish nu a vai na inivach ach aniel inivach nu a vai na lenev ach as je bekken de gaum hoshich mi berle chlechtgees Frangish skasken de hoshich en skol Frangish chaig en gu skol Frangish agus nu a vai ki onsochug a levig va bekken dragarum gan bieg triplechecke me va 3 chanineke so chado len mi leische Gaelic rish so in dras de haigra nachel Gaelic eke agus han dinne ja ha mi smich gevel bekken aan has haigra nachel agus ha mi smich gun chilje gega kujoch me va karam ekers and Gaelic a jonsoch a gerisht. Agus ha dinjakam shin Chris MacDonald. Agus ha essens cho teichgul agus cho ha ui vod ekesen ounce Gaelic kujoch. So ha essen a fiechin ri Gaelic a chumo kujoch. So ha jin of Gléidheadh chani nech toshiki a hound say nech chani lisakam like intermediate stocha a hound. So va essen a clechgig na Gaelic kuchach quality kieran ekin toshach agus ha essen guma Jonachri cursichin Gaelic a yinav no buhan obroch a yinav because so marshin hashin ula in sas leisha Gaelic hast a chaniel shin ga clechgig a hula unya ekin tuis hast gumi orstenoch.
So a bit missile in the hill.
Oh ha. So Ryan me came cool agus she flute player hanumsa flutist classicoch. So shin na train gavacumsa. Agus she skill cat and fata kimmer a hoshik me or ein Gaelic a jonsachug agus a rausachug. Ach vami son kjol daus a rausachug ag an toshach. Agus vami jolach Porstabil, agus vami in Saslish Horsnioch Gaelic in Toronto, agus vami is minnig go, well toshik mi le Porstabil shin shorsa de hjol daus. She jirach orain a hanta. Agus nura hoshik mi shen. Vil shin has kirskior. Okay. So hoshik mi akalav in a yanav, agus hoshik mi le akalav le kuchik in a hanik as neherig. Agus va Gaelic echke. Agus huirstí, van a Porstabil mirvalach nu de vashin og, agus vashin genshain gumatrich, agus gauns shin ruwa, agus so vashin ma, agus an darna akalav rain mi akalav le kuchikin a va guma va kaelichin echke ri Cape Breton, agus ha feeling to sagali kuchach, agus huirstí isha, gaat tallen Porstabil, het wavasach en je orain kjars te hangte, she jirig poers te hangte, eges ga gavig dunisem bi Porstabil, me va karam achgers en orain eile a hug, eges aan Cape Breton, gaan jullie het sheen, ga wie het sheen Porstabil, skaskeveel orain na sharachge, eges van me like, Sashin Kumbanyonoch, agus kujach va mi geistoch ri Clarion Gaelic le Porstabil a hanika macha Cape Breton. So va skill inchenoch akam. So shin kimere a glushmi vo kjol gu orain Gaelic. A chanye shidjeder a haunam sa chanye mi choma shane. Agus Kuchach en Dráasde hami a gionsachug an eel kuchach, so hami a toshach a gionsachug le Kimberly Fraser, so yeah, so hashin gama sportsel, because hami fiki ni dausa came a of kuchach, so yeah. Tapity.
Obviously, on this, I was asking you about your family, in Gaelic in your family, your music family, and your own musical talent, and you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I was saying that with my son, I have one son, his name is Kieran MacDonald. I spoke nothing but Gaelic with him at the beginning. And I guess I should have said, there's no Gaelic in I wasn't raised with Gaelic at all. It's in Toronto, and we didn't know about any Gaelic in the family. But I tried very hard to speak nothing but Gaelic with my son. My husband is also learning, and he's maybe an intermediate level speaker, and he's very supportive. And so he would also try to use Gaelic with our son. But at a certain point, it just became very difficult, and we kind of shifted away from that. And part of that was because he started at the French school. I didn't want to confuse him too much with the 3 languages when he was also learning to read. So we got away from using Gaelic, but I'm hoping that he would come back to it. And we do still do activities together in Gaelic, like go to the Gaelic college and things like that. So hopefully, maybe one day he'll come back to it. And for music, I was saying that I'm a classically trained flute player. That's what I did my undergraduate degree in. And when I started doing my research, it's kind of a bit of a long story about how I ended up researching Gaelic song. It was originally that I wanted to do dance music as an instrumentalist. And I started, because I was in this Gaelic community in Toronto, I started with interviews around Porstabil, because I thought, oh, well, that's dance music. It's just sung. And the first interview I did was with a woman who is from Harris, and she was a native speaker, and she talked about how wonderful Porstabil were, and they danced to them, and they sang them, and they were wonderful when she was a little girl. And then I did an interview with a woman who is fluent Gaelic speaker with strong ties to Cape Breton. And she was very dismissive of Porch de Biel. And she's like, oh, they're horrible. And nobody would sing them if they had a choice. And they're not real songs. They're just tunes. And in Cape Breton, people have better repertoire, which is why they wouldn't choose to sing Porch de Biel. And in the meantime, I was also seeing recordings coming out of Cape Breton, Bear McNeil's, Mary Jane Lamb, and other people, and they had Porch de Biel on them. So I was like, well, if they're so horrible, why are people recording them? And there was this really interesting discrepancy between these two interviews. And so that was how I ended up starting to do my research on Porch de Biel, and that moved me all into Gaelic song. So but I'm not much of a singer myself. But I'm also learning how to play the fiddle with Kimberly Fraser, and I've done a little step dancing too. So trying to round out my traditional background.
Yes, that's very good. Excellent. Excellent progress too.
I hope so. One day I'll play in public.
So now, Heather, I'd like to ask you a bit about your education. If you could tell us your journey.
Yeah, so for sure. I mean, I really was torn between doing a music degree and a Celtic studies degree. I loved both, and I didn't see a way to do both. And so in the end, I picked to go into music. And I was a classically trained flute player. I went to did my Bachelor of Music and actually a Bachelor of English as well, Bachelor of Arts in English at Wilfrid Laurier University, which is in Waterloo, Ontario, about an hour's drive west of Toronto. And then I did my graduate studies. I discovered in my final year of my undergraduate degree this thing called ethnomusicology, and I'd never heard of it before in my life. And I went to a guest lecture just because it sounded really interesting, and I came out so excited. I thought, this is what I want to do. And I finally saw how I could blend my interest in sort of Celtic culture and music was the way I could do this through ethnomusicology. And I did that after I came back from a year in Scotland. So I'd already done a year in Scotland, and I'd learned Gaelic while I was there, and I'd fallen in love with it. And I really felt like I couldn't afford to do all my studies in Scotland. That seemed like it was just really expensive to be going there all the time. And I'd heard of this place called Cape Breton. And I thought, I hear there's sort of Scottish culture there and Gaelic culture. I think I'm going to do my studies there. And so that's how I ended up doing my master's research, sort of focusing on Cape Breton. And you've already heard my story about how I started studying Porch de Biel and Gaelic song as opposed to dance music. I started coming out here in, I think 1998 was the first year I came out to do my research, and I just started doing my field work in Gaelic songs, and that was my master's thesis. This was all at York University. It was my master's and PhD in ethnomusicology. And when I did my PhD, I kind of built out from the Porch de Biel research. So my research was on Gaelic songs more generally and thinking about the relationship between different kinds of genres, like what made a genre like a milling song, or what made a Porch de Biel, or what made... There's actually a huge range of Gaelic songs that don't really have a label. People typically call them things like 4-line songs, or Cayley songs, or Odd and Voda, the great songs, the 8-line songs. So I talked about the 8-line songs as well, and sort of looked at what are the distinguishing characteristics, but also the value of those different genres in the community, like what roles have they historically played and socially played. Mm-hmm. So that was my PhD. And of course, you've heard as well that part of my graduate studies, I was able to go over to Colaisde on a scholarship and study Gaelic while I was there too. And that was a really great opportunity because then I was able to interview a number of people while I was there that offered a sort of Scottish perspective on some of the research that I had been doing in Cape Breton. So I interviewed quite a few singers and Gaelic speakers while I was there too.
Is there any one person or event or mentor that maybe has influenced you to get involved in Gaelic?
There's so many. I don't think I could name just one. I mean, the very first person that I ever took Gaelic from in Edinburgh was a woman, and this name is going to make everybody go, oh, I know that person, but it's not. So her name was Margaret Bennett. And a lot of people go, oh, I know Margaret Bennett. But Margaret Bennett, that everybody knows, is not the woman who was teaching me Gaelic. And it just happened to be that this woman had the same name. Mm-hmm. And she, she was a native speaker, and she just had come from Harris and had moved to Edinburgh, and she was teaching night classes because she loved her own language. Mm-hmm. And she was just I don't even know what it was, but there was just something so beautiful about how she talked about the language and how she felt about it, and she made the students feel very comfortable, and I really, really fell in love with it then. And I would actually say, too, that I think Jeff MacDonald for me was a really important person. I took lessons from him. He was teaching Gaelic through Fashion Island in Christmas Island, and I took classes with him. He probably won't even remember that, but he was so fun. He just made everybody laugh, and he had such great stories and just such a great sense of humor. So I found that really powerful. And Katrina Parsons is another really important person for me because she was so interested in Porch de Biel. And so she did a lot of workshops on Porch de Biel early on when I was, when I first came out and did my research here. She was working with the Gaelic College, and she had the Gaelic choir, and I just encountered her a lot. And so she was a really powerful influence that way too. But I think I have to really say, the names that aren't coming out here are the people that I think of them as my adopted family here. So that's Rod C. McNeil and his wife, Helen. And Helen has since passed away. But when I first came here, I said I'd never been to Cape Breton. I had no connections here at all. And I set up a tent in Waikagama. I started going out and trying to meet people. And I was very lucky. I got to go to a milling frolic that was being put on for Ontario tourists at the Highland Heights Inn in Iona. And I met quite a few Gaelic speakers at this one. So this was Rod C. was there, his brother Jamie, Maxie McNeil was there. Neil John Gillis was there. So there were quite a few really big names and important people in Gaelic song. And Rod C., bless his heart, I asked if I could interview him, and he said that I could. And so I guess a couple of days later, I went to interview him, and I came to his house, and he said, "So where are you staying?" And I said, "I'm staying in this tent in Waikagama." And he said, you come and stay with us. And so I ended up moving into their house in Barraglen and lived with them for that summer. And that was the summer that their youngest son, Paul McNeil, was getting married to Tracy Dares. And the whole family, 6 kids, all the kids and their spouses and their children all came home that summer, and they never put me out. By the end, I was in a tent in their yard, but I was always welcome in that family, and I always had a place to stay that whole summer. And, I learned so much from living there because, of course, they were retired dairy farmers, but they still had their own cows, and they were still producing milk for themselves, and they would make their own buttermilk, and they made their own butter, and they made their own cheese curds. They made mattock. It was such a traditional farm in many ways. And for me as a city girl from Toronto, it was an absolutely huge learning experience. And they were so warm and loving with me. And I learned so much from many, many night conversations with them talking. And I went to the Gaelic choir with Rod and Helen. They were quite committed members of the choir. And
you were very fortunate.
I was so fortunate and I've dedicated my book on Porch de Biel to them because I feel so incredibly deeply lucky that I have had that relationship with them, and that's carried on ever since. Yeah.
Well, I know the other Margaret Bennett.
I'm sure you do.
I met her. I had the good fortune to meet her, and I can see where she too could be a mentor or inspiration to people, because she has done an amazing amount of work.
Well, and so important because she was such an important person in the Canadian scene to document and to look at Quebec and to look at Newfoundland. And because that's the other thing. I mean, so much of us, a lot of the research around Gaelic in Canada has focused on Cape Breton, but of course it was in so many other places. And she was one of the few and one of the earlier ones to start to look at that.
Yeah, strong connections between Inverness County and the Colroy Valley people.
Okay, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
I think there's connections there.
Right, that makes sense.
So now I'd like to talk about your work and your career experience. So right now you are associate professor of ethnomusicology here at Cape Breton University and Tier 2 Canada research chair in musical traditions. Can you elaborate a little bit on those two roles? Yeah,
so I feel so fortunate that position, it's funny how these things work out, because when the job came up here, I was probably just exactly at the right place. Maybe I could have been a little further along. I hadn't quite finished my PhD, but I was just about to finish it. Mm-hmm. And if I had been a little earlier in my degree, I probably would have been too young in my studies to have been considered for the position. And maybe if it had been a little later, I would have already taken a position somewhere else, or my husband would have had a position and I would have gone and followed him. I don't know. So it was really quite amazing because I'd never thought of CBU for an academic career because there had never been a music professor here full time. Mm-hmm. I was the first one to be hired full time for a music position. And that was partly because my colleague, Richard McKinnon, was a folklorist here. And he got a Canada Research Chair, a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Intangible Cultural Heritage. And they wanted to build programs and faculty around him that would support the research that he was doing. And so we got another hire at the same time as me, Ian Brodie, in folklore. And there was a feeling that something other than folklore needed to be another hire, particularly because it was at a time when there was a hiring freeze. And so the feeling was that an ethnomusicology position would be a great way to complement the folklore position while being a little bit different. And so that was how my position came to exist. And I feel I'm very lucky in a couple of different ways because that my being hired through folklore as opposed to being hired through a traditional music program, and by traditional I mean like a conventional classical music program, meant that I could start to think about, well, what would a music program in Cape Breton look like? What would make sense here? And I wasn't bound by the kinds of conventional restrictions or expectations that most of my colleagues in music in other departments and other universities feel. Mm-hmm. So I really got to think about, well, what would a traditional music program look like? And so we did create a traditional music program. You can now come and major in a traditional music program here. And I guess we've been running for about 5 years, I guess, something like that now. So that was pretty amazing to have that opportunity. The Canada Research Chair is a true honor. That each university gets a certain number of Canada Research Chair positions that they can designate, and that was a competitive process, but I was able to get one of those Canada Research Chairs, which is wonderful. It gives me time to do research and a little bit of money, and it kind of opens doors, so that's wonderful. That won't go forever, and eventually I will no longer be a Canada Research Chair, and I'll go back to my sort of life as an associate professor, which is fine. And the other thing that I'm working on here too, so I've got this very strong connection with folklore and music, but of course I'm also the only Gaelic speaking person in the university, and we have historically had Gaelic courses here, and as the only university in Cape Breton should, and we have a memorandum of understanding with the Gaelic College, and that relationship has been very important to us at different points, and I think to the Gaelic College as well. So a lot of the care of the Gaelic courses, even though I don't teach them, has fallen to me to be sort of responsible for that and to sort of manage that relationship with the Gaelic College and any other sort of aspect that involves Gaelic here. I sometimes help the Beaton, for example, if they need some words translated or something like that. So
the course of Buckley that happens in May is a joint venture.
That's right. So there's a really long history. So originally, Hector McNeil was the director of Gaelic at the Gaelic College, and we seconded him to CBU to teach our Gaelic courses. So that was the original kind of MOU relationship with the Gaelic College. But then when the Gaelic College, Sam McPhee retired and Roddy MacDonald came in, and Hector was also sort of getting ready to kind of think about retiring himself, that created a shift in what we wanted to do with that relationship between CBU and the Gaelic College. And so what we did there was, I should say too, the other thing that we've done is the Gaelic College has offered a distance Gaelic course, which we accredited for CBU credit. So you could take it for interest, but you could also take it for CBU credit. Mm-hmm. Now that course, we ran it once recently, but we really feel like we need to revamp that course. So it's kind of not been offered for the last couple of years. But that idea animated the idea of the course of Boki. So the idea that there would be like this kind of immersion environment course, and that it wouldn't just be for fun, although it could be, but that you could actually get university credit for that. And so that is kind of a different version of what we had been doing already with the distance course. So we initiated that, and I think this was our 3rd year running that this year. And so it's been very interesting because we can get CBU students, but we also get St. FX students who can then take courses for credit at CBU and transfer that credit to St. FX. So that's working really well in that way. And then, of course, there are people who take it that don't do it for credit as well.
It's also valuable that the archives of the Beaton Institute work closely with the Gaelic College on the archives there.
Exactly.
From whence this project I'm working on arose. So.
Yeah, and there's been other ones too. Like I know that, I'm not sure how much the Gaelic College was involved with this, but the CBU has helped some other different institutions too. So the Caint Mhóibheartha project as well. Richard McKinnon, my colleague, he really helped kind of provide some training doing the kinds of things that you're doing, sort of on using technology to do audio and video recording and interviewing. And he's also done quite a bit of work with the Celtic Music Interpretive Center and some of the CDs that they've done. We've done some recordings, like when Tracy Dares was at the Gaelic College, we helped do some of the recordings that are on the Gaelic College's CD. That was the fundraising CD. There's some children's groups on the CDs, so we helped with doing the recording here. So there's some different ways that we've been trying to help with different community groups.
Could you say a few words now about other work you do related to Gaelic? I know in the teaching field, you must have had some interesting experiences.
Sure. So it's probably worth knowing too. I taught for many years in Toronto, and then when I moved here, I had done a lot of work in the Iona area, but now I was living in the Sydney area, and I really didn't know the Gaelic community in Sydney as well. So one of the first things I did is I went to the Gaelic Society, and the Gaelic Society at that time had their building on George Street. And they ran classes there. So I went to meet everybody there, which was great. And as it happened, that first week of night classes that was going on, the intermediate teacher was not well, and he wasn't able to come to the class and teach. It was fine. And then the next week, unfortunately, he died. And it left them in the lurch. They didn't have a teacher now for their intermediate students. And I said, well, I've done this teaching in Toronto. I'm happy to help you out until you find another teacher if you'd like. And they were like, oh, that would be super. Thank you so much. And then they never went and looked for another teacher. So I ended up teaching for many, many years for the Gaelic Society in Sydney as well. And after the building got sold, it was a bit of a challenge. The building had been such a place of connection for a lot of people. And it was very controversial when that building was sold. It was very, very difficult because the cost of the upkeep pretty much drove all of the activities that were happening. And sometimes the activities maybe weren't so Gaelic focused because they were the ones, though, that would bring people in. And it was exhausting for a lot of people. So I think people were just feeling like they couldn't keep that up. But then other people really felt that building was so important to the identity and as a place that brought people together. And it's true that when the building sold, that we really lost that sense of core, I guess, to the group. And part of it was also just that the controversy around it made people sort of fall away from the society. So we looked for quite a few years for different places. I taught with Kay MacDonald, who is another person I should mention is inspiring, just a wonderful person. Really, really miss her very much. She was a wonderful person in my life. And Frank McKenzie. And the three of us taught for a number of years together. And so we tried some different places. We taught at what's now the New Dawn Center for Social Innovation, was Holy Angels. That was very good for a while. We've taught up here at the university. Teaching up here at the university is a challenge because it's difficult for people to get to. And a lot of people feel quite uncomfortable driving out here at night in the winter, particularly. So,
how would you describe your own methodology?
Yeah, so you were asking me before we started the recording about talking about these different methodologies. And, it's been very interesting to me because I did French immersion as a child through the school system. And I feel pretty fluent in French. In fact, I probably guess that my French and my Gaelic fluency are similar. So I don't think of myself as an idiomatic speaker of either language. I think I seem like a learner when I speak. But I think I'm very comfortable in both languages, communicating and, understanding what people are saying to me and that kind of thing. And so it's been interesting to look at my own journey to fluency in French as a child, going through a formalized immersion school environment, and my journey to learn Gaelic as an adult, through a much more variety of methods that, and not all, definitely not all through school. And that helped me in some ways, because I really thought a lot about how people often think that they can't learn as adults. And I don't believe that at all, because I think I have. But it also really makes me think a lot about, well, what does it mean to do immersion, or what does it mean to do a more structured class? And I will say that as a teacher, night school teacher myself, I found, Gàidhlig Balla and TIP had not really, I did not know about them when I first started taking Gaelic classes and when I started teaching. So that wasn't a method that I was familiar with. And so I was teaching in the same kind of, grammar kind of environment, but we also tried to do conversational, and we always did songs, always had song sessions. And that was in Toronto when I taught, as well as in Sydney. So it was always kind of like teach for an hour, take a social break, and then sing songs for another hour. And I think that that's very important, because that connection, I know Jim Watson talks about this, and I think he's absolutely right, is that you can't, what's the point of learning a language if there's not a cultural piece attached to it, especially a language like Gaelic, where everybody speaks English too. It's not about communicating in that same way. If we wanted to just communicate, we just use English. There's something much more about it, and it's this cultural piece, I think, that is so powerful for so many people. So the language classes have to be connected in some ways to that culture. And so songs is and there's lots of historical reasons why song makes a lot of sense. So that would be traditionally how I taught. When I first learned about Gàidhlig Balla, I wasn't convinced that would work for the night classes, because you really only have like a 2-hour night class once a week. And it's not, we were being told you really need these intensive immersions to make the TIP method really work, and you can't really do that with a 2-hour weekly night class. And I still think that's true, but I think there's a shift away from wanting to do weekly night classes, right? So now we've got much more of these things like the immersion courses that we're seeing. The other thing I've noticed is that eventually we stopped offering night classes in Sydney because we just didn't get the attendance. We just didn't get people signing up. But if we offer an all-day workshop on a Saturday, we get good numbers. So it seems to me like people aren't really, for whatever reason, and I don't think it's just to do with Gaelic, I think this is just social in general, that people just aren't able to commit to a weekly night class, for example. But they're much more inclined to say, you know what, I'll go to a Saturday once a month, or I'll go, take a week at the Gaelic College, or whatever it is. And that is much more conducive to the sort of Gàidhlig Balla method. And I have to say, too, that at the university, we've had to think about a little bit, at CBU, we don't want to duplicate what St. FX is doing. So St. FX has Celtic studies, and they have a really good system that they've worked out for their program. What can we do at CBU that would complement instead of compete with them, that would offer an alternative that would work for some people, but maybe for others, it would make more sense at St. FX. And for me, we've really thought about that immersion environment, that Gàidhlig Balla, as a kind of organizing principle. So that's part of the reason why we did the course with the Gaelic College the way that we did, because it's organized around Gàidhlig Balla. But because it's a university course, we also wanted to make sure that there was some of this more traditional reading and writing there too. So we've kind of, I think, and I've worked a lot with Carmen MacArthur, who teaches our courses for us here at CBU and teaches the immersion course at the Gaelic College. We've kind of worked that out so that the emphasis is on conversation and using it and learning through sort of everyday experiences, which is sort of the principle of Gàidhlig Balla, but also marrying that with a little bit more of the reading and writing than maybe the traditional Gàidhlig Balla or the TIP method would use.
So your own style would be a combination of...
I think so. I've shifted a lot more towards Gàidhlig Balla. I don't teach Gaelic very much anymore just because we don't have the night classes here. And, I'm kind of involved in my research and that kind of thing. And there are other people who are teaching. So I haven't done so much of it myself recently. But I have, the Gaelic College had me come and do one of the immersion weekends, for example, and I definitely was using Gaelic Bala in that environment. Like, I'm quite happy to use that method. I do think that there's different kinds of learners too, and I think that that's something else that we want to keep our eye on is that, and people have different reasons for learning Gaelic. So some people, it may not be about the conversation. Maybe they really want to be able to read, Gaelic, and they're doing it for historical reasons, or, so I think that there's, I think Gaelic Iqbal is very powerful, and I think it's really, really worth developing and growing. We are, and I'm absolutely fully supportive of that. I also think that there are ways that we complement that with different kinds of learning structures or environments, and thinking about the learner and the motivations for learning.
So I'd like to talk to you now, Heather, about your research work and how that research led to the publication of a book. Mm-hmm. In 2014, was it? You published a book. And the name of the book is Reeling Roosters and Dancing Ducks, all about Celtic mouth music. Mm-hmm.
So this is, the book looks like this.
Okay, can you hand it over to you there so the camera can...
So this is, so the title came from a Porch de Biel. So this is, the Porch de Biel is Really na Colicu Estausi na Tunikin. So that's how I got the title of the book. Back towards me, or?
No, I think in the light. Yeah, right there. That's great. Perfect. Thank you.
Good.
So it was published by CBU Press?
It was published by CBU Press in 2014. And basically what it was is that I had thought about, my master's thesis was all on Porch de Biel. And so the original intent was to basically turn my thesis into a book. But in the end, it became a complete rewriting because there was just so much more that I had learned since I had done that thesis. The thesis was in 2000, and this came out in 2014. So I had a lot more research to do and a lot more insights that I had learned over the years. And so the book is actually quite completely different from the original thesis. But that's how I came to do the book. I've told you a little bit about my master's thesis and my PhD. Mm-hmm. My research right now, what I'm really interested in is there's a movement in scholarship in general, but in ethnomusicology in particular, around something that we call applied ethnomusicology or applied research, which is the idea that scholars shouldn't be doing research that's just irrelevant to the general public. I mean, the general public, taxpayers pay my salary, they pay for the research money that I get. What value does my research have for the community? I have to be thinking about that a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I've been thinking a lot about what can I do as an ethnomusicologist that will be of value to the Gaelic community. And I'm very interested right now in language revitalization and thinking about what can a music scholar offer language revitalization. I think we typically think of language revitalization as being something that a linguist would do or a Celticist would do, not an ethnomusicologist. So I'm really playing with that. Right now, we were talking before we started the interview about a new project that I have. A few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, Lewis McKinnon, the director of Gaelic Affairs, asked me if I could help create a dictionary of Gaelic in Nova Scotia. And I said, okay, well, I think this is an exciting project. I think I need a little time and I think I can help, but I can't do it right yet. And so we just kind of left that. And when I went to a Gaelic conference, Celtic Gaelic, at Gléidheadh last year, I encountered people there who were working on a dictionary of Gaelic. They're working on the sort of most comprehensive dictionary of Gaelic in Scotland that has ever existed. And I realized that now I had a whole group of people that I could tap into who had already figured out, how do you do a dictionary? I don't have that expertise as a music scholar. That's not my area. And I realized that we could partner with them to figure out how we could start to put this together. And what I was also thinking about is I'm very interested in thinking about, well, what ways does music create the entry point for learning language? And I think, a lot of times when we encounter Gaelic learners in the classroom, a large number of them will say that they came because they were inspired by a song. They were moved by a song that they'd heard and they wanted to learn that song, or they wanted to sing and they wanted to know what they were singing instead of just learning it or like just as sounds. I think that's very powerful. And I think a lot of the other thing that we see is with linguists, and there's also, I'm actually working with some psychology professors right now too, who work on motivation and the motivation to learn language. The emphasis typically is on language, quite separate from culture. And culture is an add-on, something that enriches the language classroom, but isn't the primary vehicle. And I'm interested in thinking about it quite differently. So I'm playing with some different projects right now. The one that I'm just mentioning to you is we got some money, and I'm working with Lewis and then Roy Burstall-Mallory at the University of Glasgow, who's working on this dictionary of Gaelic in Scotland. We're putting together a digitized collection of Gaelic songs. This is how I'm using music as an entry point to the dictionary. So we're going to start with songs. We're going to collect as many songs as we can from Nova Scotia. We're going to digitize as many as we can, and we're going to put those lyrics into something called a corpus. And the corpus is basically a big database. And then when we go to do the dictionary entries, you look up a word and you see, when did that word appear? What genres of songs did it appear? What region did it appear in? Was it a man or a woman whose song it appeared in? So you can start to trace the meaning of the word, when the word was being used. Did the meaning change? Was it specific to particular regions?
The root of the word.
Exactly. You can start to look at the root of the word, all of these kinds of things, the idioms that it would be used in. So this is the newest way to do dictionaries. And we haven't had a Gaelic dictionary that's done that yet. They've always been done by individuals who have a particular knowledge, and wonderful people like Dwelly, but who are necessarily limited by their own individual knowledge. By having this corpus, you have this giant database of language that you can pull from. So we're going to start with the songs. And then if this goes well, we'll go for more money and we'll try to get some other kinds of documents beyond songs that could then feed into this corpus and give us a more robust database to draw from when we get to the dictionary. So some of the other things that I've been looking at is I'm working on hopefully an app because I'm quite interested as well in the idea of technology and how can technology help us with learning language. And I think there's a few reasons that helps us with Gaelic. For one, it counters this kind of myth that Gaelic is an old-fashioned language. Secondly, it's more likely to appeal to youth. So youth are using apps. We need to be connecting language and culture into what they're already using. And the third thing is that technology gives people access to language and the supports that they need as learners exactly when they need it, because it's so portable and mobile. You don't have to go back home to look it up in your dictionary or whatever. So I'm playing with an app idea right now that I'm calling like sort of a Gaelic song dictionary. So the idea is that there would be songs, and that you would be able to touch the words on the songs on your screen, and it would give you a definition of that word. So you're coming to the language through the song rather than just through the words kind of separate on their own.
Sound clip attached to...
I think so. So I'm playing with that. And would I use archival recordings or will I have them newly recorded? I've got to kind of figure that part out. I haven't got that figured out yet. The other thing I think that really makes sense here too is that for me, I think that songs were the traditional dictionary for Gaels, right? Like in the past, before we had dictionaries, people could point to songs. And I've heard people in the community do that. When I was learning, people would say, oh, that word means this, just think of that song. And they would sing a line. And then that would justify that this is why you can use the word in this way. Same thing with grammar. People say, oh yes, you can use that grammar, think of this song. And so we use songs as a kind of oral dictionary and grammar in Gaelic. So using an app like this, I think also is a modern version of something that's quite traditional. We did a survey to kind of see what people would be interested in, and people talked about that over and over again, that they want the audio file, they want it slow as well as up to speed, right? Yes. So that they could really imitate it, but they could also hear what it should sound like in the end, right? Mm-hmm.
So you've also worked on recently on a project about disaster songs. Can you talk about that, the traditional songs that were often written about disasters that happened in Nova Scotia.
Yeah. So I should say, I kind of have 3 areas of research right now. One is Gaelic song, and that's my most, my oldest area, and the area that I've been working on, obviously, the longest. But I also have 2 other areas. And I should just say, too, I want to go back to the Gaelic song for one other thing. I mentioned that I'm working with some psychology colleagues who are working, they're social psychologists, and their research expertise is on motivation. And particularly the motivation to learn language. And they typically are looking at ESL, so English as a second language. What motivates people to learn English?
Can you share their names?
Yeah, so my colleague is here, Peter McIntyre, and another one is Susan Baker. And Susan is currently at Grenfell College with the Memorial University in Newfoundland, but she's a graduate of CBU, and she's from Cape Breton. And she wrote her PhD thesis on the differences between learning French and Gaelic in Nova Scotia, the motivations that cause them to learn these languages. So Peter is quite a well-known person in his field, and he was asked to write an article for a journal on motivation to learn languages other than English. And he and I have talked a lot about my research, and we've been interested in working together. And so he thought, and he knew Susan, and he thought, well, maybe we could do something on Gaelic. And there's a real need. We really need this research on what motivates somebody to learn a language that is what we call a heritage language, a language that isn't, there's a different reason to learn English than to learn Gaelic, or there's a different reason to learn Mandarin or French. These are world business languages. And there are reasons when you travel that you might not be able to speak another language. You have to learn that language. Gaelic, as I mentioned earlier, is not the same thing. There's no such thing anymore as a Gaelic speaker who doesn't also speak English, for example. So we don't have that same reason for people to learn language. But it's the same kinds of reasons we would learn Gaelic, that you might want to learn an indigenous language, or that there's all sorts of languages all over the world that are minority languages, that are languages of that community that are really threatened. And if we want to save these languages, and right now linguists are saying there's about 7,000 languages in the world, and that in the next 100 years, we're probably going to see the loss of half of those. If we want those languages to survive, we have to figure out what it is that's going to motivate people to learn those languages. So my psychology colleagues are working on that motivation piece, and what we looked at was in what way might music motivate people to learn Gaelic. So again, thinking of music as that driver to learn the language rather than the add-on piece that you put on later. So we interviewed quite a few people who are traditional musicians here who have different levels of knowledge of Gaelic, and looked at how those pieces played together, the language and the music. And so we're still working on that. So that's the other area, I should say, too, that I'm working on with Gaelic song. But then you were asking me about my other areas of research. So I'm also researching disaster songs of Atlantic Canada. And then my most recent is on traditional vernacular folk dance of Cape Breton. So looking at step dancing and social dancing, square dancing.
You recently wrote one on the history of the Scotch Four, I see.
I did. I just wrote a little article on that.
That's very relevant to the Inverness County.
Absolutely. Well, and we really haven't had much of that history. We have, we're very lucky that we have Matt Smoleen, who's at the University of Limerick, who's so knowledgeable about Scottish dance and Cape Breton dance. And he's just published a book in 2015 on step dance in Cape Breton by CBU Press as well.
John Gibson as well.
Yes, and I just got that book, so I'm just starting to take a look at it. And John Gibson, of course, is extraordinary for his, I don't know if there's anybody better for doing historical research. Like I'm sure it's a treasure trove of information, so I'm eager to get through it. But, we really haven't had too many people really focusing on sort of the history of some of the dancing, and particularly the social piece. So the step dance, I think, has a lot of visibility. So, but what about things like the square dancing? So I did the Scotch Four piece on that history. And then I've got an article that I'm just about finished that I'll submit to a journal on the loss of the collar in the square dance. So what happened to the square dance collar that we used to have lots of in Cape Breton?
The prompter.
The prompter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
So, yes, he goes by both names. So sometimes people call him the prompter and sometimes the collar. So, so I have a little article on that I'm just finishing off. So that's my most recent research. And in fact, one of the most interesting things that I was able to do recently was there were a group of us that brought 9 dancers and scholars who came together last year here from Ireland, Scotland, Quebec, Newfoundland, Ottawa Valley, and here. And we taught each other dancing, in England, I should say, too. And we taught each other our step dancing. They were all step dancers, to kind of think about what are some of the connections between our dance traditions. Because we tend to think of step dancing traditions as very distinct and separate. So, Ottawa Valley is Irish and English and French, and Cape Breton is Scottish, and Newfoundland is Irish, and, and we don't think about, but these are all Canadian traditions, and they're all linked to these British Isles and their traditions. Where are the connections instead of thinking of them as completely separate? And you want to hear the most interesting thing is we had this English clog dancer who came, and I thought, well, that's great. My friend who did Ottawa Valley was really interested because she thought there'd be a lot of connection to Ottawa Valley. And I thought, well, Cape Breton's all Scottish. There won't be much connection there at all. And that was the step that was the closest of any of the steps that we did to the Strathspey step that we did in Cape Breton. And Kimberly Fraser was here too, and I think she would say the same thing. It was remarkable. So anyway, that's the step dancing work that I'm looking at right now. So I just wanted to fill in a couple of little gaps that I feel like I missed when I was talking. When you were talking about influential people, I did also want to mention Morag Burke, who I taught with after Kay MacDonald died, and who's just such an absolutely wonderfully knowledgeable person about Gaelic and so supportive of learners. And so she's another really wonderful person worth mentioning and strong person in the Sydney area. On the research front, I did also want to mention in terms of the dance research, I also helped to get digitized an absolutely incredible collection by Barbara LeBlanc, who's originally from New Waterford, but it now lives in the Shetty area. And she taught for many years St. Anne's University, but at the Shetty campus. And she, in the 80s, did a dance project for the Museum of Man, as it was known at the time, in Ottawa. And she interviewed just about every single person you could imagine in Inverness County who was related in any way to dance. She interviewed fiddlers, pianists, prompters, square dancers, step dancers. And that material is gold. She did this in 1986. Many of those people have passed on. Some of them were young at the time. Did she interview you?
Well, no, my uncle included, I think.
I was thinking Duncan, but that's not Duncan A. Is that who you're talking about? Yeah, so I wonder if he was in that.
Sure. In 1986 he was.
So then that was so then that material was pretty, it was, she did videos of dances, she did interviews, she transcribed them, and that was all hidden away in Ottawa. And so I worked with Barbara and the Beaton Institute and the Museum of Civilization, or now it's History, to digitize that material, and now it's all available through the Beaton Institute, and that material is amazing. So I just wanted to mention that as my dance research. And then I really have given short shrift to the Poor Disaster Songs project because it's the least Gaelic related, but it's and it was a complete kind of movement into a new direction for me. But I've been doing research on disaster songs of Atlantic Canada, and I have a website, disastersongs.ca, and that has been surprisingly enjoyable for me, despite the morbid sort of topic matter. It's fascinating. And perhaps the most interesting thing Gaelic related is how few Gaelic language disaster songs there are. I have very few, given that in Scotland there are so many of them, so many shipwrecks and drownings. But very, very few seem to have been composed in Nova Scotia. I wonder if there is just such an emphasis on sort of positive thinking and love of land and love of culture that there wasn't really a desire to document these tragedies.
It was more laments written in Scotland, more for grieving the homeland, grieving loved ones. Yes, for sure. So but we see less of that here. I find that interesting. Yeah. So anyway, that's the little piece I would just sort of mention about disaster songs. Can you give an example now of one of the disaster songs? Oh, sure. Comes to mind? So one of my favorites is called The Captain Torres by James Callaghan, who's a songwriter out of Calgary. It's a shipwreck song, and the Captain Torres went down in 1989, just off of the coast of Cape Breton, on its way. Well, it was on its way, taking scrap metal from the U.S., going up the Great Lakes and out the St. Lawrence. It was on its way overseas. Was caught in a terrible storm and went down with all of the crew. And it's got quite an interesting story, because the story, as James Callaghan has it, is that the crew knew they were going down. They contacted the Coast Guard,
Coast Guard couldn't get to them because of the weather. And so the crew asked if they could be patched through most of them were from New Caledonia and New Australia, and asked if they could be patched through to their loved ones to say goodbye, and that each one of them was given 2 minutes. Incredibly moving, except that then when I told the story to somebody else, it turned out that the student that was at CBU, her father worked at the Coast Guard at the time that the ship went down, and she told the story to him, and he said that never happened. And so I've actually gone back to look at the Coast Guard record, and there is a very detailed description of this shipwreck and of everything that happened that night, and there is no reference to this calling to the families. So very interesting to think about, how did that story come to be? How did that get entered into the story? So, but anyway, the song is stunningly beautiful. It's really worth taking a look at. So that would be one that's got the Cape Breton connection. And a lot of people sort of say, well, why doesn't anybody know about this? It happened right around the same time as the Montreal massacre that happened of the women that got killed. And we always, because that was a Canadian story and this was a non-Canadian ship and a non-Canadian crew.
That was in December 1989.
That's 89, right? Mm-hmm.
I remember.
That's right. So that Montreal massacre just kind of overshadowed what had happened with the Captain Torres. So nobody really knows that story.
Who sings the song?
His name is James Callaghan, and he's actually going to be at Celtic Colours this year, and he's been at Celtic Colours before. So,
good to know. So I'd love to ask you a couple of questions now, if you don't mind, about back to your book, Reeling Roosters and Dancing Ducks, because Porte is very important, I think, in the Cape Breton tradition, and you've accumulated an awful lot of interesting stories in that book. But one of the things I saw an interview with you and Johnny Gàidhlig person, several actually on YouTube, and there's some great information there. One of the things I remember you saying on there is that singers are more likely to know Porte than instrumentalists. You remember saying that to Johnny Gàidhlig?
I know that. Yeah. And I think that's a shift today. I think that historically is maybe not true. So I think historically it would be instrumentalists who would have been more likely to know Porte, and they would have used them as a way of transmitting tunes to each other. Yeah, so I think Porte today are being sung more by singers, but historically they would have been used more by instrumentalists. So in the past, I think they were really powerful ways for people to transmit a song to each other, or we see it being used for dancing in the absence of instruments, particularly women at home who would have sung them perhaps for their children as their children were learning to play an instrument or to dance, but not necessarily by singers. You know, I mentioned earlier in our interview about how early in my research, I interviewed somebody who said, Porte weren't real songs. They were really tunes, and singers wouldn't choose to sing them. That they really were something of an instrumental tradition that you happen to sing. But I think that as Gaelic song has become of greater interest, and world music has become of greater interest, and songs in other languages and cultures, Porte has become much more of a singer's tradition more recently. There's a lot of reasons for that. Porte work really well with people who don't speak Gaelic. You don't have to speak Gaelic to enjoy a Porte because it's a great dance tune, a great instrumental tune. And in fact, the lyrics are often kind of silly anyway. So it's really the sounds that are more interesting. So they're a great audience pleaser regardless of fluency, whereas other Gaelic songs are much harder to appreciate if you don't speak Gaelic as well. And they're great. They offer a great kind of upbeat, enjoyable, bouncy tune in between some of these really long songs that we have in Gaelic. They're an incredible. They do a lot considering what, a little kind of song they are, because they can be used to teach a tune. They can be used to teach dancing by accompanying them for dancing. They can be used for learning to speak words to whether it's a learner like a child, or it can be, because in many ways they function. In many ways, there's a lot, people draw parallels to children's nursery rhymes. certainly there are a lot of push-to-beal that are not appropriate for children, but others are. And definitely that repetitiveness and the kind of silliness to it is wonderful for learners and for children. So it's a great language transmitter. But at the same time, you're also learning something about the melodic structures in Gaelic. So, I mean, these things, so these things are pretty powerful little things that we have in Gaelic.
Do you see any differences in the songs written in Scotland to songs written in Nova Scotia in terms of content and sound? And
like today, or you mean at any time?
Today. New compositions today.
Yeah, so this is another area that I would really like to do some work in. I started doing some work a little bit when I was still teaching Gaelic. I'm interested in thinking about, we've lost our Gaelic bardic tradition here, I think, really, because we've just lost so many of our native speakers of Gaelic. And learning to write, that was such an important part of Gaelic culture here, and all Gaelic culture, is the songs. What do we do when we lose the bardic tradition? And how can we reintroduce a bardic tradition to a primarily learner community of speakers? It's very hard to think about how to learn a language, how to write a song, even in the first language that you speak, let alone in the language that you've learned as a second language. So I'm really interested in thinking, can we teach people to write songs in Gaelic that are learners? And I think we need very specialized, different kinds of teaching techniques than what you might use if you were teaching somebody who's a native English speaker how to write an English song, for example. So I'm really interested in that because I think we have some beautiful songs recently, and I think we have a lot more people who are closet songwriters who won't sing in public. But we really have a lack of songs coming out of Cape Breton right now, or out of Nova Scotia.
So there's a lot of new young fiddlers arising in Cape Breton, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. What are your thoughts on preserving Gaelic expression through the violin music?
I think that one of the most exciting things that I'm seeing right now is I feel like there's a new generation, a younger generation of people who are really interested in a sort of more holistic understanding of their culture, which includes the music and the dance and the language and the stories. And that is the tradition. The tradition was that there would be people who would have all of these things, that could hold all of those things and present all of those things. And I think for a while we really got away from that. I think there was really sort of these specialists. And I feel like what I'm seeing with younger people today is a greater interest in bringing those things back into a package. And I think, when I talked to you about my research with my psychology colleagues, we interviewed many of these young fiddlers. And pretty much all the ones that we interviewed on purpose had done Gaelic language to varying degrees. And some of them were quite fluent, some of them were not. But all of them talked about that influence of Gaelic on their music and the influence of music on their Gaelic. And this is what I mean about music as being a potential entry point to the language. It may not be about starting with Gaelic and moving into music. Maybe we start with the traditional fiddlers, and then that becomes the entry point to the language. How can a knowledge of language enrich your playing? How does that... And it's not just that they share roots, that it's a Gaelic root. It's that the rhythms of the language, the stories that were told through the language, enrich the playing style, the rhythms of the music, the ability to talk about the tunes, the stories behind the tunes, the ways that the tunes would have been used. Those are all connected. And if we can use music as that entry point to language, that might be a very powerful motivator.
Well, this might be a great point to show an example of of that. If you would consider sharing some portion of your music with us.
Sure.
To illustrate that point of how the voice of the Gaelic comes into the music.
Yeah, so I first must apologize because I'm really not a singer, and I really like to make that clear to people. The ones that I like to sing are ones that were really well known here, and some people have kind of commented that maybe there were never a lot of Porshtabeel here, although if you look into some of the collections like the Gale Stream that John Shaw collected, there are dozens of Puirstibíal that were being sung here. So I think there are quite a few that maybe just never were documented because people just didn't think they were that important. Mm-hmm. But anyway, there are two that are often still played together as fiddle tunes, and they're actually some of the only fiddle tunes that we still use the Gaelic names. So a lot of fiddle tunes have Gaelic names, but then they also have English names, and sometimes the English names are translations of the Gaelic, sometimes they're completely different. But these two tunes are still known by their Gaelic names, even when you're talking in English. And that's Callum Crúpach and Mulindu, and they're almost always paired. They're almost always paired as Puirstibíal, and they're almost always paired when they're played as fiddle tunes as well. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the blas. So this is the debate is, do you need to be able to speak Gaelic to be able to play the tunes correctly? And the idea being that you would, if you were playing them correctly, you would have the songs running through your head as you played the tunes. And for those of us who speak Gaelic, we know that length of vowel is significant to meaning of a word. So I always like to give the example of sapich and sapich, which look the same in writing, except for the accent over the A that gives us the longer A. But if you said Lana Sapich, you're talking about the day of the fight, not the day of the Sabbath. And so this very significant meaning just from lengthening the A. That's the kind of rhythm that gets embodied in the language that then has to get translated into the music. We don't have that in English. We don't have the significance of length of vowel to meaning of words. We can lengthen a vowel, but it doesn't change the meaning of the word. So that's what people are really referring to, I think, when they're talking about that connection between the music and the language. There are people, though, who say, well, that rhythm of the language has entered into the fiddle style already, and you no longer need to speak the language. It's embodied in the style anyway. So if you've learned to play the true Cape Breton style, that Gaelic flavor will still be there, even if you yourself are not a Gaelic speaker. So Callum Crúpach is a Strasby, and Callum Crúpach means lame Malcolm or lame Callum, and it's just about he needs to keep his sheep over there and don't let them come over here, and this is what I mean about kind of silly lyrics. And Mulindu is the real, and Mulindu is the dark mill, and or the black mill, and it's about the mill is moving around in the summer, and that's where the moor hen roosts. That the nests are there. And so this, again, people are kind of like, well, what does this mean? Why is the mill moving around? We don't really know. There's a number of stories, and I've got some of those in my book that try to talk about what that story may be. It's some question about, could it be like an actual alcohol still, like a still house rather than like a grain mill or something like that. So who knows? Anyway, again, apologies for not being a singer. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri chula. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri chula. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri chula. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri chula. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri chula. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri chula. Callum Crúpach a glan cúmahan na cúri. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri chula. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri chula. Cúmahan na taranala cúmahan na cúri. And net na kick a fruik is a Mulindu, sa Mulindu, and net na kick a fruik is a Mulindu, oh howdy, and net na kick a fruik is a Mulindu, and net na kick a fruik is a Mulindu, oh howdy. Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, should talk a stola gausa. Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, should talk a stola gausa. Shimmy grut na sil shifts a Mulindu, sa Mulindu, shimmy grut na sil shifts a Mulindu, oh howdy. Shimmy grut na sil shifts a Mulindu, sa Mulindu, shimmy grut na sil shifts a Mulindu, oh howdy. Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, should talk a stola gausa. Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, a Mulindu a hooramin, should talk a stola gausa.
So
I'd like to ask you now, what changes you've seen over the years with regard to Gaelic language and culture in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, so I see a lot of interest among youth, And I think things like Gaelic Igbala have really excited the community and really energized the community to reclaim the language and become involved again. And I did want to mention, I think one of the most interesting innovations recently was the Gales Jam that was held for 3 years. I hope that there'll be another opportunity to do that. And that was sort of the initiative of Tad Hargrave, who did his degree at Celtic Studies at St. FX, and Amber Buchanan, who is from the North Shore. Her people are from the North Shore, and she ended up coming and doing her degree at CBU. And they were really interested. They attended these events that were jams, and the jams were really sort of this idea of how can we bring young people together and initiate sort of leadership among young people. And not specific to Gaelic, and in fact, sort of broadly speaking, and kind of bringing people around the world together. And so there are these jams that are held in various places around the world. And they both attended jams, and in fact, Tad Hargrave had been involved in helping to create these jam movements. And they proposed that we should have a Gaels jam specifically to help bring up leadership among young people in Gaelic in Nova Scotia. So they held these 3 years. It was a bit controversial because people felt frustrated that they weren't youth to qualify. So that was a bit of a challenge. And in fact, the last year they opened it up to any age, even though the principle of the jam originally had been to focus on youth. I felt completely privileged to attend. These are residential events. They were 3 days the first time and 5 the next 2 times. And incredibly intense and intimate. Really exploring some of the issues around, well, what keeps us from speaking Gaelic, or what issues do we personally internalize around our feelings of being inadequate as speakers or as contributors to the community. And this is a huge issue we have to learn to manage as a learning community in particular. But there's native speakers too who feel anxious. So I'm not a proper speaker. I make mistakes, and the learners think the same thing. And it was really powerful in terms of exploring those issues, but also about building a community. And I really feel like many of the people who participated in those Gaels jams have created a strong sense of community amongst themselves, that there are bonds between the people that participated. And different people enjoyed it to different degrees. Some people didn't like it. Some people really loved it. But I do really feel like that was a very different way of thinking about what are the issues that we're facing and how can we move forward and focus on youth and have sort of youth-driven initiatives moving forward. It was very hopeful and positive and really focused on relationships. So I think that's been very, very positive. I think that a lot of the things that Gaelic Affairs and the Gaelic College are doing are incredibly powerful. Things like Nagashki Galka, things like Bunas Bar, wonderful, very interesting, distinctive programs that build on the strengths of this community, we are seeing all sorts of, I think, really wonderful effects. I think we see a really great interest in Gaelic right now among a great part of the population. So those are some of the things that I'm seeing as being sort of the future, changes. I guess, and some of the changes. Yeah, and
things have changed since the Kennedy report came out in 2001, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And the ups and downs that have happened over the years with regard to how Gaelic was not encouraged, shall we say.
Yeah, and I think we've had to kind of, I think there's a whole generation of people who've just so internalized the negative aspects of Gaelic that it's very hard to move past that. Yeah. And maybe part of it too is, I think every generation reacts against the previous generation. So if there's a generation that has been a negative towards Gaelic, then it's maybe not surprising that the next generation is like, well, darn it, we're going to like it. So I think there's a something of that to it as well. But of course, it's also partly that there's just the younger generation was never taught to dislike Gaelic. And in fact, the other thing I should say about sort of the future and maybe the way things are changing is we must also think about the Aboriginal community. And I think we're starting to think about, well, what are the parallels and the similarities between the Gaelic experience and the Aboriginal experience? What are the differences? Because in whatever way Gaelic was systematically abused, I guess, and disliked and dismissed and tried to be erased, Gaels are white, and they enjoy a privilege that comes from that racial identity that Aboriginal people don't. so there are some significant differences, but I also think that there are some really powerful connections that we can share with each other. We both have the Aboriginal community, the Mi'kmaq community, and the Gaels are both struggling with minority languages that we want to save. And we can help each other with that. We can work together to figure that out. And we've had similar experiences of language being dismissed. And we have similar values around valuing community and relationships with the land and with our kin. So I did actually get involved with Lewis McKinnon, and as well as Mike Hunter and Stephen Augustine and Jaime Batiste to run an event last year where we brought Gaels and Mi'kmaq together just to talk about some of the topics that are of value to both groups, to explore where there might be some overlap and similarities for cultural understanding and to build some bridges between those communities. And I think there's a lot for us to learn still about the ways that the Mi'kmaq supported the Gaels when they first arrived here, and how we can continue to support each other as cultural groups that coexist in this province.
And there's a lot of talent in both groups.
Absolutely.
That can be shared.
Lots of brilliance, lots of great ideas and energy that we can, if we can work together, we could achieve all sorts of really amazing things, I think.
And it was nice to see this year at the Broadcove concert. One of the performers was a group of Aboriginals.
I wasn't there. That's wonderful to hear. I didn't know that.
That's actually great. You can watch it on YouTube.
I will do that. That's great.
So, what future do you see for Gaelic language and culture now in Nova Scotia?
In Nova Scotia. It's a challenge because we are still, as a whole world, trying to figure out how do we save languages that are struggling. And we've talked about that a little bit before when we were talking about, that if we have 7,000 languages today and 50% of those are going to disappear within 100 years. This is not a Gaelic-specific question. This is a question that is facing languages and cultures across this world, and it's facing other languages here, such as Mi'kmaq, but even Acadian French struggles as well. So, I don't think we know yet the answers to these questions. How can we help these languages survive? What I would say is there's an incredibly positive attitude towards Gaelic right now, and a great deal of youthful energy around it. And I think quite a few people who've been in the Gaelic community for a while really see that as a difference, and a really hopeful difference, that there's a lot of interest in Gaelic and support for Gaelic and a belief in it as a language and a culture and a desire to support it. And you were at the Gaelic Summit that we had at the Gaelic College recently, and that was interesting because quite a few of the people who were there from Ireland, from Scotland, as well as from Nova Scotia, commented on the importance of inclusivity. And one of the challenges that we have, I think, is that the label Gael is sometimes understood to refer specifically to language rather than to a broader cultural identity. And people feel like, well, if I don't speak that language, then I'm not a Gael. And how do we create an identity that says you don't have to speak that language to be a Gael, and that the Gaelic identity is more than language. Language is very important, but it's not the only way to be a Gael or to express a Gaelic identity. And in fact, if it was the only thing, then why would we have it? It needs to be all of these other pieces that come together. So you're absolutely right. We need to figure out how do we make that culture inviting and inclusive and really ensure that people feel like they belong to it and connect to that in various ways.
So do you have any advice for Gaelic learners of any age?
That's so hard because I think everybody's path to Gaelic is so different, and it's so, as a teacher, I'm so conscious of the fact that the students that come into my classroom can have so many different motivations for being there, so many different reasons for wanting to learn any subject, including Gaelic. It's hard for me to say because, what motivated me to learn the language? Well, part of it was I just fell in love with it when I encountered it. I didn't know I was going to become an ethnomusicologist who specialized in Gaelic song. So that wasn't my first motivation, but I was also highly motivated by the fact that my research had to do with Gaelic. And so that gave me a reason I wanted to learn it anyway, but then that gave me a justification for the time and the money that I needed to spend on it. And that's not going to be everybody's reason. So that's hard to say. I think my advice is that people need to find their own reasons for wanting to learn that culture or that language. And I think also to be patient and to be gentle on oneself, because I think it's easy to feel inadequate, and that we need every speaker at every level to contribute to the language and to the culture and to its revitalization. And I guess that would be maybe that's my best piece of advice. My best piece of advice is just use the language. Whatever you have, use it. Because it doesn't matter if you make mistakes, and it doesn't matter if all you can say is Kimera how. It's using it that matters, and it will always be meaningful to the people who hear you say that, hear you use the words in Gaelic. If they have Gaelic, they will be so grateful that you use that language. And that's true of any language. I see this with French all the time. And people feel ashamed. They say, oh, I don't have very good French, or I don't have very good Gaelic. But you have some. Yes. And that's so... it's so uplifting to know that somebody else cared enough to learn something from that language and to try it. So I would just say, just use it. Yes. And if you need to pepper your Gaelic with English to get it out, that's fine. Just use it.
And sometimes volunteering at something that you've never tried before opens a door.
Oh,
and
yes.
So anyone that wants to explore other languages, try volunteering at a Gaelic event.
Yes, absolutely.
And just see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. Make a Gaelic friend.
Yeah. And, it's amazing the hold the Gaelic takes on you once you do get...
That's right. That's right.
Into it.
That's right.
You never lose it. So do you have any final thoughts you'd like to say before we end the interview today? I forgot to mention one thing, and that's your participation yourself as a volunteer on the Celtic Travel Bursary Endowment Fund Committee.
That's true.
Of which I'm a member too. But it's interesting to be a part of that committee, because it has quite a history too. Started by some very influential Gaels in Nova Scotia, including Senator McEachen, Reverend Malcolm MacDonald, Sister Margaret MacDonald, Alice Freeman. I could go on and on. Buddy McMaster was on that committee originally. So
I should say too, I'm also very involved with the Gaelic Society, the Cape Breton Gaelic Society, which is struggling at this point. There's not very many people left, but for many years I've been the chieftain, which is, I guess, the equivalent of the vice president kind of thing, helping out with that. And so we have money that we give to the Gaelic College for bursaries, for example, and we give money to the McConnell Library for Gaelic books for their collection, for example. And we've ran for many years concerts in the summer with Gaelic and piping and fiddling and dancing, and that would raise money for these other initiatives, but also help to sort of just celebrate that culture in the community. So that's maybe another sort of one of the big areas that I've been involved with. And also I've been, for many years, I've been involved with the American Gaelic Society, which had a university scholarship. And I was involved on the scholarship committee, and that has helped to support a number of students from Nova Scotia, as well as people from elsewhere, to study Gaelic either here or overseas in various capacities. So yeah, I feel like my job as a university professor is deeply embedded with community, and so I often find myself involved in voluntary positions of various types, and it's quite blurry sometimes what's my job as a professor and versus sort of community volunteerism.
Heather, I'd like to thank you once again on behalf of the Gaelic College for participating in this interview today. It's really a pleasure to talk to you and learn all your background and your history and your great research you're doing and all that you're contributing to the revitalization of Gaelic.
Well, as I wrote to you privately, it's an honor for me, and it really is quite meaningful to know that you think that the work that I'm doing is worthy of documenting in this way. And, I'm not from here originally, but I feel so connected to this community, and, things like this, being asked to participate in an interview like this, just furthers those connections and that sense of feeling bonded to people in the culture here. So I'm very grateful to you for being interested in what I do. Thank you.
Modern thing. I guess Sammy Dawkins can be Caramella. I can.
Sammy Dawkins, Gléidheadh.
Gléidheadh.